This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by the upcoming Grim Hollow Monster Grimoire, which is coming to Kickstarter in just a few weeks.
Our friends at Ghostfire Games are releasing this book packed with over 300 new monsters for 5th edition.
Kelly and I love dark fantasy, and this book is offering an amazing bestiary of horrific creatures, abominations, and undead monstrosities inspired by your favorite tales of grim, dark, dreary monster tales.
Not only that, but this book is going to contain rules for how to harvest monster parts and the crazy items that you can make with those parts.
Also, the book is going to be packed with tons of great advice for dungeon masters on how to make the most of these monsters in your adventures and encounters. So check it out. It's going to be launching on Kickstarter in just a couple weeks, but you can follow the links in the description below to sign up for their mailing list on Ghostfire's site so that you can be notified as soon as the Kickstarter goes live.
And now, onto this week's episode.
Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for players and guides for dungeon masters.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we are talking about the 3 most powerful tools that players and dungeon masters can use to add more flexibility and creativity to their games of Dungeons & Dragons. Retraining, Reflavoring, and Retconning.
With these 3 R's, we're going to be discussing what they are and how to use them. We're also going to look at how to implement them properly into your game and possible pitfalls that you might come into with these 3 options.
It's very important to use all of these tools in moderation. It's not really appropriate to allow players to change their characters completely every game session, or completely revise all your campaign's house rules week after week after week after week, or go completely wild and make it so that the player's actions never have any consequences and nothing matters because everything is always just a churning sea of chaos. Using retraining, reflavoring, and retconning well requires very good judgment on the part of dungeon masters and players, as well as a healthy dose of moderation to make sure that the game remains meaningful. Today, we're going to talk about how to do that.
On the flip side, though, using these 3 options properly to benefit the game can actually have a major impact and improve role-playing at the table, improve the fun that the people at the table are having, and help you run a satisfying adventure. So keeping in mind when to use these 3 options and how to use them is actually one of the most important tools in a dungeon master or a player's tool belt. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
First and foremost, there is the concept of retraining. Now, retraining actually already exists in the core rules of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. There's many classes and subclasses that whenever a character gains a level in that class, they're able to switch out one or more character options. For example, sorcerers can change one of their spells known for another one every time they gain a level, and warlocks can change out their invocations whenever they gain a level. This allows characters to make gradual, small changes to their characters and means that they're not always locked into their character selections whenever they level up.
With the introduction of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, we have actually expanded upon these rules, with many of the classes getting options to switch out or change certain features, spells, or other attributes as they level up. And it's kind of opened it a lot more than it used to be, but there is still some room for some house rules and homebrewing here.
Yeah, you can go much further with this and simply extend the option to any character that whenever they gain a level, they can change one choice that they prior made. Maybe they want to change an ability score increase that they gained, or a feat that they gained. Or maybe their subclasses allow them to choose between a couple different options for one of their subclass features, and you're going to allow them to change that out in some way. There's a lot of flexibility that is to begin with this, because sometimes the reality of it is that a player thinks an option looks cool on paper, and then they try it out at the table and they don't really like it. And rather than having them live with that choice for the rest of the entire campaign, which frankly sucks, it allows them to make a more informed choice once they've had the benefit of experience.
Something that happens a lot is players who are brand new to the game of Dungeons & Dragons and choose to play a spellcaster will see spells that sound awesome. But also I find that spells have a specific niche within your play style as well. Some people love spells like Suggestion or Phantasmal Force and the options that these create at the table, where other players who might have been recommended these spells by more experienced players grab them, try them out at the table, and can't really get the hang of them, or they don't feel satisfied with the way that they are using it. And they might want different spells. This has happened at my tables several times, and I think with newer players specifically, it isn't a detriment to the game to be extremely lenient on having them swap out spells, specifically if they have grabbed spells that they are using 0 times at the table, and there's another option that would have suited them better. In my experience, letting new players play around with the options presented to find what works best for them means that when they get to their second, third, or fourth player character that they've created, they're going to have a better understanding of what's going to work best for them, and they will have to do this less. But when I'm running a game for new players, I am very loose with this concept, and I have let players do everything from pick new spells or feats to even changing their subclass when halfway through a campaign, they've realized that it is not working for them.
Changing a subclass is actually a really cool thing to integrate with an important story moment in a campaign, and there's a lot of cool role-playing opportunities that this can present as well. So the retraining can be reflected in the story of your game. We might imagine, for instance, a warlock switching their patrons and turning their back on the fiend to embrace the celestial. Or perhaps even a cleric decides to abandon their old deity and change their domain. You might even go even further with this and have a character that maybe loses their powers and changes their entire class. A paladin could have a personal crisis of faith, break their oath and become an oathbreaker, or just as easily, you could have that entire character suddenly become a fighter and not a paladin. You might see perhaps even a barbarian cool off the rage and end up transforming themselves into a druid because they've gained new wisdom. You might even allow the character to make drastic changes to their ability scores to represent a massive change that happened in their storyline. Perhaps the barbarian, they cooled off, they've lost their strength, they've gotten old, but as they've gotten old, they've gotten wiser. So it makes sense to change their ability scores around and turn them into a druid instead. These can open up some really interesting ways of promoting character development and evolving the character's stories, especially over the course of a long-term campaign. So I like to keep this option open. Again, it should be a special and significant moment. If a player simply comes to me at the start of a game session and says, yeah, I'm not really feeling being a sorcerer anymore, I just rewrote my character as a warlock, I'm going to be like, no. We got to talk about this.
Yes, at the same time, a player who time and time again is having difficulties getting into the options that they have chosen, I think that the right thing to do to make sure that that player has a rewarding experience at the table is to allow them to change. I had a player character at my table who was playing a Great Old One Warlock and used none of the abilities, none of the expanded spell list, and was using nothing presented from the Great Old One Warlock. I kept asking this player, why are you not using these features? And her response to me was, I just don't like them, and they're not the way that I play. We wrote into the campaign a switch from the Great Old One to the Fiend that actually had powerful story elements tied to it. I was able to do that for her. She switched to the Fiend, and she had way more fun from then on, using many of the spells presented in the spell list and loving throwing enemies through hell. So it really worked for her playstyle, and she had a much better experience. Her characters after that were much more refined and much more specific in what spells she picked and what she looked for in her subclasses.
Yeah, this is a great example of when to do this and when it's right. When you've got a player that is just changing their whims and is always trying to find the latest power build from the internet and bring that into your game session, that's not the kind of disruption that you have to tolerate at your table. That's far too generous. If you do have a playgroup that does want to experiment with lots of player options and changing out their classes, builds, and characters almost every sort of game session, maybe you actually want to theme your campaign around the idea of an adventurer's guild that allows each player to play several characters. So you really want to put a limit on how much an individual character gets changed around, because it does make it feel less meaningful when you do this too much. But if you attach it to the story, you give a few opportunities for players to make small changes incrementally as they level up, and are open-minded about working with players to improve their experience at the table. It can be really satisfying and rewarding and really add a lot to your game.
Another really important time to think about including retraining in your campaign is when new source material comes out. Whenever there's a major release for Dungeons & Dragons, it gets a lot of people excited. And a lot of these major releases include things like new spells, new feats, new subclasses, sometimes even new classes. If a new book comes out and there are options presented in that book that are very exciting and appropriate for a character at your table, and they come to you and say, hey, I actually wish that I had taken the Mind Sliver cantrip, I say there's no harm in letting them. This is the exact time for retraining. If they leveled up last session and Tasha's came out and they say, I want these spells instead, I like to have these conversations and open it up. And I've actually very openly told my players, hey guys, a new book just came out. If you'd like to read through it and let me know if there's any changes you'd like to make to your characters based on what's presented here, let's have a conversation about it. And it's been a very rewarding experience, and nobody's really tried to mess around with me on that. They just find the things that stood out to them and are really cool, and we have a nice conversation and build their character based on what they've discovered.
Retraining is also a great way to experiment with awesome third-party content or your own homebrew material, trying out things in a small scale, and if they work well, continuing to use them, and if they don't, retraining them out and forgetting about it.
As we move on to reflavoring, this is one of the key tools for both a DM and a player to find a satisfying way to broadcast their characters, villains, NPCs, and world to the game of Dungeons & Dragons. Reflavoring is simply the idea of taking the mechanical side of D&D and removing it from the lore side of D&D and adding in your own elements to dictate what the mechanical side of D&D is saying it does.
Think about this like redecorating the room of a house. The furniture is the same, the layout is the same, the structure is the same, you still use it the same way, but all the color, cushions, blankets, wallpapers, the curtains, all those are different, which can really give it a fresh new look and a fresh new take. Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition has lots of character options, but it doesn't even scratch the surface of the wide range of fantasy, mythological, and creative storytelling archetypes that exist out there. There are tons of ideas that you could think of for characters, monsters, spells, NPCs, and locations that don't really have a clear example of that within the rules of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. But it's easy enough to find a rough equivalent and make that work well. A really great example of this is that in one of the earliest campaigns that Kelly DM'd, we were doing a nautical-themed pirate campaign set during the Age of Sail and Exploration, where there were gunpowder weapons, but also magic. My character in that campaign was a gun mage. I was playing a wizard, but my wand was a pistol, and my spellbook was a bandolier of bullets. And I prepared my spells by loading bullets into the pistol and cast them by firing the bullets. Fundamentally, I was still playing a wizard. We didn't make any house rules or any changes, and we made sure that the mechanics were roughly equivalent. But I felt like a gun mage, and the character felt very unique, and I had so much fun thinking of interesting ways to explain the ways all the various spells that I took worked. There were easy ones, like casting Firebolt, or loading in an incendiary round to cast Fireball, but I really had to think a lot about how is Dimension Door going to work for this character, which of course turned out to be I'm shooting a bullet over there and teleporting to where the bullet lands. So there's lots of creativity, and you can kind of go wild with the potential once you're unshackled from thinking that the rules have to dictate exactly what the lore says on the tin. In many cases, most spells have no more creative description than their name. The spell Dimension Door says Dimension Door, but there's nothing in the spell description that says anything about dimensions or anything about doors.
As a similar example, in one of my campaigns, a character wanted to play a polearm master wielding a glaive mechanically, but wanted a weapon that resembled something more closely to Kratos' Blades of Chaos from the God of War series. He asked me if this was okay, and of course I said yes. The decision was that we would just use polearm master and the glaive mechanically, and nothing else would change. But he got to implement these sort of whip-like blades into his gameplay, and he actually used them to describe the way certain spells work, the way he moved around the battlefield. Sometimes in certain instances he would use it to latch onto things and swing, even though he was just using the same jump abilities normally presented. But he got to use this to amplify his explanation, his role play, and the flavor around the way his character acted. And this really helped define the character for him and helped him have a lot more fun. But mechanically, nothing changed from the glaive and the polearm.
We've seen really extensive examples of this. For example, Brendan Lee Mulligan of Dimension 20 did a fantastic campaign using the 5th edition rules set in New York City, a magical version of it. It's a really creative, wonderful example of this element of reflavoring being used to completely change the setting and location away from the normal fantasy roots of Dungeons & Dragons into something completely new and original. There's tons of great examples to draw in for inspiration for this, and you really don't need to change many rules to make it work.
On the flip side of this, for the Dungeon Master, being able to reflavor things like monsters is actually really easy and also creates a fresh and exciting experience for your players. Every time you say, "There are 3 trolls in this room," most D&D players either know or learn very quickly to set them on fire to deal with them. If you can find a way to describe the monster without using its name, it creates a much more elaborate mystery of what the creature is that they're facing.
For example, if the players enter a den where there are 3 hulking creatures covered in boils, tumors, and other cancerous growths, that every time their weapons dig into their flesh, the cancerous tumors regrow and knit them back together, they're going to think they're facing a very horrific monster. It's just a troll.
And this can be applied to almost any monster. Are you sick of goblins in your campaign and you'd rather use something that you've created yourself? Just grab the goblin stat block, throw a new coat of paint on it, call it whatever you want, and you are basically homebrewing, but without having to do any work. And this actually applies to all monsters presented in there, including the NPC stat blocks and various other elements thrown in the monster manual and other source books. You can take anything, call it what you want, describe it how you want, and use the stat blocks presented. And now you are creating a unique experience at your table that the players won't be able to know what's coming, but you're still using all of the standard information presented because there are hundreds of stat blocks to choose from. And even if you're trying to create your own unique stat block, there's a good chance that there's something 90% or higher the same already presented.
You can save a ton of time doing this. Making stat blocks for NPCs and monsters, particularly when you're only going to be using those creatures in a single combat encounter, is something that is a huge time sink in game prep. It's worth doing for recurring NPCs or major villains. But for most combat encounters that you're going to be creating, and even for NPCs that will not see combat, using a stat block out of the back of the monster manual or the appendixes in Volo's Guide to Monsters is far more efficient. And just being able to go, you know what, if I change this monster's creature type from fiend to elemental and change the damage type from cold to fire, I have exactly the monster that I'm looking for, is a really, really powerful tool at your disposal. And in particular for NPCs especially, there are NPC stat blocks in the back of that monster manual, like the gladiator or the assassin. And I have used the gladiator stat block for things that are not gladiators in any way, shape, or form, but just represent a generic fighting guy with a shield. I have swapped out the spells in the archmage stat block to make archdruids and archclerics. And I cannot tell you how many times I have changed kobolds into ratlings.
This is especially useful if you are dealing with a group that you've played a lot of D&D with. Even if they don't mean to, a lot of players who have a lot of experience playing D&D will have a sort of metagamey approach to knowing what monsters they're going to face and how to deal with them. This is just something that's going to happen as they deal with more and more monsters in the games of Dungeons & Dragons. But a simple reflavoring actually has a great impact. I myself am pretty well versed in the monsters of Dungeons & Dragons. When Monty is my DM, he always asks me after the game, did you know what monster that was you faced? And I'm going to say 75% of the time, I actually can't guess, or I guess wrong, because I thought he might be using something, but I don't have all the stat blocks memorized. I have some key elements of a lot of monsters memorized, but simply changing the way it's described makes me second guess what I think I know.
There are so many just stock stat blocks in the monster manual that you can use and reuse. If you ever need any kind of big dumb brute, just use the stats for a stone giant. If you need some sort of dog-like creature, you can pretty much just pull in a hellhound or a winter wolf or a dire wolf. They're going to fundamentally behave the same way, even if they look completely different. It's really easy to just recycle these things and breathe new life into them, even though you're using the same old stats.
You can extend this even further for DMs who are homebrewing their own worlds to actually take things from pre-written adventures that really spoke to you or inspired you in some way and reflavoring them, changing all the names and locations, and just moving them into your homebrew setting. If there's a certain campaign that presents a group of factions that you actually love and you just want to meld them into your own campaign world, you can actually take all the mechanics, concepts, and ideas from that campaign, move them into your own, change some of the names and the way the characters present themselves, and you have a fresh idea. This can be used whole cloth on almost any piece of any adventure module.
Now, the final tool that we're going to discuss today is the retcon. Retcon is a literary term that is quite well known that stands for retroactive continuity. And this often happens when new plot elements are introduced in a storyline that might contradict a previously introduced plot element. It happens all the time in even professional big movie franchises, and it is a way of covering up plot holes and continuity errors that inevitably happen when gigantic, sprawling, fictional worlds occur. It happened to Tolkien, it happened to the MCU, happens to everybody. Sometimes you have to get in there and retcon something in order to make the current lore and the current storyline that you're developing make sense with what you've done previously. Ideas evolve and change over time. This is inevitable, and you should allow yourself to be able to use this in your own games of Dungeons & Dragons and your campaigns.
Now, on the flip side, retconning has a gray area that you want to make sure that you are staying in. You want to be okay with retconning pitfalls and traps that you fall into, but you don't want to be the DM who retcons absolutely everything all the time. If you're constantly changing the lore of your world and shifting the way things are working, if you elaborate on a house rule 1 week and then completely change that house rule the next week, and this is a constant thing for you, it's going to actually be a detriment at your table. But knowing when it's okay to retcon and feeling okay with doing it is important. And really, this is for those moments when you kind of paint yourself into a corner and you're trying to weave together things that you said months ago that aren't clicking the way you wanted them to click, and you don't know what to do at your next game session. What we're trying to say here is that retconning is okay when you have no options to fix this in other ways, and you're actually making way more work for yourself rather than just saying, well, we're going to retcon this and this is how it's going now. This is the way that it's working moving forward, and let's push forward with that. And I think players should be okay with the DM doing this because, especially in a homebrew setting or campaign, there's a lot of imagination and effort that goes into it, and we have to be okay with the fact that nobody's going to get it perfect.
Retconning can come into play when you just forget a rule or make something inconsistent. Like, for example, maybe you forgot that, oh yeah, you can't teleport without line of sight with Thunderstep. It doesn't work like Dimension Door. Do you go back and retcon that and then say the players are dead? Probably not. Generally speaking, I don't retcon things that are going to thwart the players or screw them over. I retcon things because something doesn't make sense, or because I need to fix a plot hole that is going to create more problems for me later, and I'm going to have to explain things. One of the nice things of knowing that when you do make changes in your campaigns by retconning things is that if the players actually haven't seen it yet, it's fair game. So if the players don't know what is around the next corner of the dungeon, you can change it. If the players suspect that the king might be a Rakshasa, and they're right, and you're like, oh, that's kind of boring now, but they haven't proven it yet, you could change it, but you want to be careful about those sort of things. If the players have a hunch about something, and they're right, and it hasn't been fully revealed yet, don't rob the players of the satisfaction of being right, just to surprise them. Again, so often, many creators of fictional worlds, even ones that are highly professional and working on very high-profile projects, think that subverting expectations is more creative than delivering on what was foreshadowed. Foreshadowing is such a powerful storytelling element, and faking somebody out to subvert their expectations is not always the right choice, especially if you're going to retcon details in the process.
Sometimes people guessing what the answer is ahead of time is one of the most rewarding experiences for that person. And that is something that we need to be aware of. That subverting expectations, everybody loves the twist ending. But sometimes people love equally guessing the ending and seeing it play out and seeing how it happens the way that they imagined. And both sides are equally rewarding. And so when you are choosing to retcon something because the players are guessing it, be extremely careful. If in session 1 they piece together who the main villain is and that was the mystery of the whole campaign, maybe it's a good time to retcon that without them knowing. But if in session 1 you lay down some clues and they guess what might happen in session 2, then let it ride. Let them foreshadow themselves and guess what's coming up and let them play it out. It's going to be an exciting experience for them.
One of the other things that you might have to retcon somewhere down the line is if you introduce something like your own unique magical metal or magic space rocks or crystals or some new form of magic or some sort of divine providence or certain elements of characters, NPCs, religions, or cosmologies in your setting, that all these elements that you're juggling at once. As a DM, you're one person, and you might have lots of irons in the fire at the same time and juggling all these plot elements, and then you realize that you've actually created a plot hole or a tangled mess or a tangled web, and just kind of need to get in there with a pair of shears and claw out all the weeds so that things start making for your sense again. That's okay. And if you do have to come to your players and say, you know what, hey, you guys, I'm going to axe a couple of the extra deities in this setting or change the way a couple of these house rules work because they're getting a little bit unwieldy. That's okay. Make sure that that happens in a conversation with your players, and you should feel like you can evolve the lore of your world. Fundamentally, when you're running a Dungeons & Dragons campaign, you should not hold yourself to the standards of professional published broadcast media like books, massive film series, TV shows, and otherwise. You are one person developing one world on your own for your friends. You don't have to be a master storyteller that is ironed over every single plot hole. There's going to be a few along the way, and if you have to retcon a few things to make some things make sense so you can have a fun game of D&D on a Friday night, who cares?
So this has been a look at retraining, reflavoring, and retconning in Dungeons & Dragons. If you have any advice that you feel that we missed or have great experiences using these tools, tell us about them in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. We have an amazing community on Patreon that also comes with our patron-exclusive Discord community where you can chat about us, about your favorite nerdy topics, everything Dungeons & Dragons, or the behind-the-scenes of our DRAKKENHEIM campaign. If you want to join our community, follow the links in the description below to find out how.
And if you're interested in our DRAKKENHEIM campaign, our Season 1 Dungeons of DRAKKENHEIM is coming to Kickstarter. We have partnered with Ghostfire Games to bring this adventure to life as a 5th edition module. You can join the mailing list below or go to DRAKKENHEIM.com to get all of the updates involving this Kickstarter. And don't forget to check out our live play in the Worlds of DRAKKENHEIM, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes of that show right up over here.
And we have plenty more videos giving great advice for Dungeon Masters in D&D 5e right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.